When Marine Le Pen walked away from the 2022 election with over 40% of the vote, it wasn't just a warning. It was the breaking point of France's post-war political order. The once untouchable centrist establishment has fractured under the weight of mass protests, economic stagnation, and a pension system buckling from demographic pressure. Emmanuel Macron, elected as a technocratic bulwark against extremism, now presides over a deadlocked parliament and a furious electorate. His constitutional maneuvers to pass reforms have backfired, deepening distrust and fueling both far-right and far-left radicalization.
The dollar is falling. The empire is fading. But your voice is rising. Don't just watch history happen. Be part of it. Why have you checkmark subscribe to this channel for more fearless analysis from Richard Wolff and voices the mainstream media refuses to platform?
The political center hasn't just eroded. It's collapsed, leaving a volatile vacuum at the heart of the EU's second-largest economy. France's economic trajectory is equally unstable. Decades of unchecked borrowing, masked by Eurozone interest rates, have left the country with a debt burden exceeding 4 trillion euros. Pension obligations alone consume over 14% of GDP, far higher than EU peers, and demographic shifts ensure that imbalance will only grow. Credit downgrades and surging bond yields echo early warnings of the Greek crisis, but on a far more dangerous scale. If France falters, the shock won't stop at its borders. It will shake the foundations of the euro, rupture EU cohesion, and redefine Europe's geopolitical landscape. This isn't just a national crisis. It's a systemic one. France is falling apart. And this time, it's not hyperbole. It's not protest slogans or media spin. It's hard numbers, collapsing institutions, and a political system on the brink. What we're witnessing in France right now isn't just another chapter in a long history of unrest. It's a convergence of crises that threaten to unravel the republic from the inside out. Economic fragility, political dysfunction, and social chaos are colliding, and the ripple effects are starting to spread across Europe. At the heart of this unraveling is a debt crisis that no one in power seems capable or willing to confront. France's public debt has ballooned past 4 trillion euros, with borrowing outpacing growth and fiscal responsibility tossed aside for decades. Cheap money, enabled by the euro and perpetuated by complacent leadership, has allowed successive governments to delay the hard decisions. But the bill has come due. Interest rates are rising, credit ratings are falling, and the Eurozone is starting to feel the tremors. France, the second largest economy in the Eurozone, is looking disturbingly like Greece in the years before its meltdown. Only this time, the stakes are exponentially higher. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. The French state, once a model of welfare-driven governance, is becoming structurally unsustainable. Its pension system, one of the most generous in the world, now consumes over 14% of GDP, far above EU average. The problem isn't just fiscal, it's demographic. An aging population, a shrinking workforce, and longer life expectancy have exposed a fundamental flaw in France's post-war social contract. The system was built on the assumption of endless growth and a strong birth rate. That assumption no longer holds. And when President Emmanuel Macron tried to confront this reality, modestly, even cautiously, by proposing to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, France exploded. Massive protests paralyzed cities. Strikes crippled transit. Public outrage boiled over, not just at the reform itself, but at the way it was forced through, using a constitutional loophole that bypassed Parliament. Macron's decision to go around the legislature didn't just backfire, it shattered what was left of his political authority. The move was seen as undemocratic, arrogant, and deeply out of touch. And in a country where trust in elites was already on life support, it only made things worse. What followed was a collapse of centrist credibility. Macron's party lost its parliamentary majority. The government splintered. And the political vacuum that emerged didn't stay empty for long. Marine Le Pen, the far-right national rally, once considered unelectable, is now within striking distance of power. Years of economic pain, cultural fragmentation, and elite failure have created fertile ground for populism. The old Republican Front, the informal alliance of parties that banded together to block the far right, has crumbled. Voters are no longer scared off by Le Pen's rhetoric. They're embracing it. Her message of nationalism, anti-globalism, and French sovereignty now resonates with millions. And her rise is being met not with robust opposition, but with resignation. This is no longer a fringe movement. It's a reshaping of French politics. The center has collapsed. The left is fragmented, often veering into radicalism of its own. And the right, emboldened and rebranded, is positioning itself as the only force that can restore order. That's how democracies shift. Quietly, slowly, and then all at once. The consequences of this shift aren't limited to France. If a far-right government takes control in Paris, the entire European project could be thrown into crisis. Le Pen's party has historically opposed European integration, criticized NATO, and flirted with pro-Russia sympathies. A government under her leadership would mean a France pulling back from Brussels, challenging the Eurozone, and undermining Franco-German cooperation, the very foundation of EU stability. And the timing couldn't be worse. The European Union is already stretched thin, economically, politically, and strategically. A French pivot toward nationalism would weaken the EU's ability to present a unified front on everything from migration to defense to climate policy. It would embolden other populist movements. It would fracture the fragile consensus that holds the bloc together. It would send a dangerous signal to the world that one of Europe's anchors is drifting away. Financial markets are already watching closely. France's bond yields are rising. Credit agencies are issuing warnings. The parallels to Greece's pre-crisis indicators are too clear to ignore. But France isn't Greece. It's bigger, more central, and far more systemically important. A sovereign debt crisis in France wouldn't just threaten the Eurozone. It could break it. The European Central Bank would face impossible choices. Bail out France at massive cost and risk moral hazard, or hold back and watch the crisis spiral. Either path risks catastrophe. This is the price of delay. For years, French governments papered over structural problems with debt, betting that growth would return and that reforms could wait. That bet has failed. The post-2008 financial crisis revealed the cracks. The COVID-19 pandemic widened them. And now, the entire foundation is at risk of collapse. And yet, there's no consensus on how to fix it. The public opposes austerity. The unions oppose reform. The politicians fear backlash. The institutions are paralyzed. What's left is gridlock, anger, and rising extremism. France is stuck, unable to move forward, but no longer stable where it stands. And behind it all, the bigger question looms. What happens when one of the West's leading democracies can no longer govern itself? What happens when economic models fail and democratic institutions lose legitimacy? These aren't abstract questions. They're playing out in real time on the streets of Paris, in the halls of the National Assembly, and in polling stations across the country. France's crisis is a warning, not just for Europe, but for every advanced democracy struggling with debt, aging populations, political fragmentation, and rising populism. When real problems go unaddressed, radical answers become appealing. When leaders lose touch with ordinary people, extremists step in. When reforms are postponed for too long, they become politically impossible. And when democratic trust is lost, it doesn't come back easily. If at all, the stakes couldn't be higher. France isn't just another EU member. It's a founding pillar. A permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear power, a cultural giant, a country whose trajectory influences not just Europe, but the entire global balance of power. If France goes down the path of political extremism, economic collapse, and social unrest, the consequences will be felt far beyond its borders. But right now, that's exactly where it's headed. This is the cost of ignoring reality, of pretending debt doesn't matter, of assuming the post-war model can survive forever without adaptation, of assuming that voters will always choose stability over disruption. They won't. Not when they're angry. Not when they feel betrayed. Not when the system stops working. There's still time to course correct, but not much. Structural reforms are urgent. Pensions, fiscal discipline, competitiveness. And they'll be painful. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is collapse. Economic, political, and social. And once that begins, it won't stop at France's borders. If you're watching this and thinking, this doesn't just apply to France, you're right. The same trends are playing out across the West. Ignoring them won't make them go away. Pretending everything is fine is how systems break. So don't look away. This is real. It's happening. And it matters. If this breakdown in France shocks you as much as it should, then share this video. Like it. Comment below with your thoughts on how the West can wake up. And hit subscribe. We got a lot more to unpack. Because what's happening in France right now could be the beginning of something much bigger. And we all need to pay attention. France is on the brink, and the world is still pretending this is business as usual. It's not. What we're witnessing is a slow-motion implosion of a major Western power, and no one seems willing to call it what is. The second largest economy in the Eurozone is sinking under the weight of its own contradictions. And the rest of Europe? Watching nervously from the sidelines, hoping this time the fuse fizzles out before it reaches the powder keg. But there are no guarantees anymore. The numbers don't lie. The institutions are faltering. The political system is splintered. The streets are boiling. And the question no one dares ask out loud is becoming impossible to ignore. What if France really is collapsing? At the heart of the crisis is a simple truth. France has promised too much to too many for too long without paying for it. The post-war social contract, built on generous pensions, expansive healthcare, and state-heavy economic protectionism, was designed for a different era, a younger, more productive France with a growing workforce and manageable debt. That France no longer exists. In its place is a nation struggling to fund its promises with a shrinking tax base and an aging population. The math doesn't work anymore. Pensions alone are devouring over 14% of GDP, one of the highest shares in the EU. And yet any attempt to touch that system is treated like political suicide. Macron tried, and the backlash nearly burned down his presidency. Raising the retirement age by just 2 years sparked protests in every major city. Strikes paralyzed the economy. Violent clashes became routine. But more than that, the people lost trust not just in Macron, but in the very idea that reform is even possible anymore. Because this isn't about retirement. It's about despair. It's about a public that no longer believes its leaders are working in their interests. A public that sees elites as detached, arrogant, and insulated from the consequences of their own policies. Macron's use of a constitutional clause to ram the pension reform through without a parliamentary vote only confirmed the suspicion. The system isn't listening. It's ruling. And into that void of trust steps the far right. Marine Le Pen isn't rising by accident. She's rising because the center has collapsed, because the left is fractured, because the traditional parties have nothing to offer except nostalgia and technocratic jargon. Meanwhile, Le Pen talks about sovereignty, about borders, about putting France first. And in a country where the middle class is shrinking, immigration is politicized, and economic anxiety is boiling over, that message lands. For years, Le Pen's party was treated as toxic, an untouchable force outside the bounds of acceptable politics. That's over. The firewall is gone. Voters who would never have considered her are now nodding along. They've tried the socialists. They've tried the conservatives. They tried Macron. Nothing changed, except that things got worse. And now, the far right isn't a warning. It's a solution, at least in the eyes of millions of disillusioned citizens. And the far left? They're gaining too. But not by offering unity, by pouring gasoline on the fire. Anti-establishment rage is now the common language of both extremes. The center has become a no-man's land. Legislative gridlock is permanent. Macron's coalition is barely functional. Parliament is paralyzed. And with every new scandal, every new reform failure, the legitimacy of the Republic erodes just a little more. This is how democracies die. Not with a coup, but with a slow bleed of credibility, with institutions that no longer serve, with leaders who no longer connect, with policies that no longer deliver. And in France, that process is accelerating. Meanwhile, the economic fundamentals continue to deteriorate. France is now dependent on low interest rates and ECB intervention to stay afloat. Its debt is massive and rising. Over 110% of GDP. And as global financial conditions tighten, the cost of borrowing will go up. That means less room for stimulus, less flexibility in a downturn. and more vulnerability to market shocks. The parallels with Greece in 2010 are uncomfortable. Back then, no one believed a Eurozone country could default, until it did. And when it happened, the contagion nearly ripped apart the euro. Now, France, unlike Greece, is too big to bail out and too dangerous to fail. If France tips into a sovereign debt crisis, the euro itself could unravel. That's the nightmare scenario the EU won't admit publicly, but everyone behind closed doors is preparing for. And the markets are beginning to take notice. Bond spreads are widening. Credit ratings are under pressure. Confidence is slipping. France can't afford a loss of trust, because when that goes, everything else follows. Investors pull back. Growth stalls. Borrowing costs rise. Austerity looms. And the social contract, already fraying, snaps completely. That's when the riots return. That's when the far right and the far left stop campaigning and start dictating. That's when the Republic enters uncharted territory. And here's the bigger problem. France's fall isn't just France's problem. It's Europe's. The EU is already teetering on division, North versus South, West versus East, Federalists versus Nationalists. A full-scale crisis in France would shatter what little cohesion remains. Germany loses its primary partner. Brussels loses legitimacy. NATO loses a major pillar. The global order loses another stabilizing force. And geopolitically, it gets worse. A far-right French government that questions European unity, that cozies up to Russia, that undermines shared defense. What does that mean for the transatlantic alliance? For sanctions policy? For EU expansion? For the war in Ukraine? France isn't just a flag on a map. It's a lever of global influence. If that lever turns inward, or worse, turns hostile, the consequences will be felt in Washington, in Berlin, in Kiev, and beyond. And yet, the window for meaningful reform is closing fast. Macron has lost the public. The far right is ascendant. The institutions are gridlocked. And the economic cliff is approaching. Structural reform is politically toxic, but economic collapse is inevitable without it. That's the impossible choice France now faces. This is the new European powder keg. And this time, there's no outside force to blame. No foreign invader. No global collapse. Just a slow, internal decay caused by years of denial, dysfunction, and delay. France isn't a victim of fate. It's a casualty of its own refusal to adapt. And this isn't about ideology. It's about reality. The numbers are real. The protests are real. The extremism is real. And the threat to Europe's stability is very, very real. If France doesn't change course, it could be the first domino to fall in a much larger crisis, one that redefines the West for a generation. So what happens now? Either France finds the courage to reform, or it continues to slide toward irreversible decline. There is no middle ground anymore. The old consensus is dead. The system is broken, and the clock is ticking. France is unraveling, and it's no longer possible to deny it. For years, politicians, media, and technocrats dismissed the warning signs as temporary setbacks. They called the debt manageable, the protests sporadic, and the rise of extremism fringe. But that illusion is collapsing. What's happening now isn't episodic. It's systemic, and the longer France clings to denial, the more brutal the reckoning will be. The country is trapped in a downward spiral. Economic decay is feeding political chaos, and political chaos is strangling any path to economic recovery. It's a feedback loop with no exit under the current leadership, and the public knows it. That's why trust in government is near historic lows. That's why protests are no longer rare, they're routine. And that's why people are turning to the extremes. Not because they believe in every radical idea, but because they've given up on the center altogether. The rot goes deeper than one party or one president. It's structural. Successive governments, left, right, centrist, have all kicked the can down the road. No one dare confront the core issue, that France's generous post-war welfare system, once the pride of the Republic, is no longer financially sustainable. The retirement age has barely moved in decades. The state still guarantees benefits it can't afford. The bureaucracy is bloated. Productivity growth is stagnant, and public debt is exploding. But the moment of reckoning is here. France can no longer borrow cheaply forever. Its credit ratings are under pressure. Investors are watching. And the European Central Bank won't always be there to buy bonds when the markets flinch. France is entering dangerous territory, where fiscal policy is cornered, political will is gone, and international confidence begins to slip. And that's when things get dangerous. Because once a government loses credibility, it loses control. Just look at the chaos after Macron used constitutional powers to bypass the legislature and force through pension reform. That wasn't a show of strength. It was a confession of weakness. A government that can't win a vote on basic fiscal policy is no longer governing. It's improvising. And France, a nation that prides itself on republican order, is starting to feel ungovernable. Meanwhile, Marine Le Pen is waiting, watching, calculating. She knows the country is inching closer to the edge, and she's positioning herself as the only alternative to elite failure. Her party no longer needs to scream. It just needs to wait for the collapse of the status quo. And unless something changes fast, she'll be handed power not through a revolution, but through the ballot box. Not because she won, but because everyone else lost. And what happens then? A far-right government in the heart of Europe, one with deep skepticism of the EU, hostility to immigration, and open disdain for the liberal international order. France, one of the architects of the European project, could become the force that unravels it. Brussels is terrified of this possibility, but they're paralyzed because the EU has no plan for a founding member turning against the system it helped build. And it wouldn't stop with France. A Le Pen victory would embolden nationalist movements across the continent. The populist surge in Italy, the rightward shift in the Netherlands, the simmering instability in Eastern Europe. Le Pen's rise would energize them all. The domino effect would be real, and the dream of a unified, democratic Europe would be in mortal danger. This is the knife's edge France is walking. It's not just about pension reform, or public debt, or electoral volatility. It's about whether a leading Western democracy can hold itself together in the face of overwhelming pressure, whether it can reform before it breaks, whether it can restore trust before rage takes over. Right now, the answer doesn't look good. And let's be clear, this is inevitable. France still has the resources, the institutions, and the talent to recover, but it requires political courage that's been missing for decades. It means confronting hard truths, making painful choices, and putting national survival above partisan games. That hasn't happened. Not yet. So the crisis deepens, and the world watches, hoping it will all just fix itself. It won't. If you're watching this, understand. What's happening in France is a warning to every other democracy teetering on the same ledge. Delayed reforms, ignored debt, eroded trust. These are not French problems. They are Western problems. And the outcome in France could be the dress rehearsal for a much larger collapse. Don't look away. If this resonates with you, if you see the same warning signs in your own country, share this video. Like it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe, because this isn't just about France falling apart. It's about whether anyone is willing to stop it before it's too late.